A couple of years ago, I had a series on my main channel called Who's Greater, where I would compare all-time great players versus each other, where some people think one or the other is the better player, look at their careers, take in the context of all of it, and determine who actually has the better resume and who should be ranked higher all time. Haven't touched that series in a very long time, and obviously the format over on the main channel has changed. I said after I made that change that I would bring those types of videos over to the second channel. I haven't really made good on that, but I figure now, being that it's the dead of the off season, would be as good a time as any to bring this series back. So if you want to see this Who's Greater series, if you want to see a certain matchup, comment that below, but most importantly, leave a like on the video to let me know that this is a series that I should keep doing. Also, subscribe if you're new, and if you want to enjoy this as an audio-only experience, check us out over on Spotify. But with that said, let's talk about Steph versus Magic. Rather, there's one point that I want to make right out of the gate, and I feel like this should be pretty much universally agreed upon, but it isn't, because people like putting people over players that they just have no business over all the time for nostalgia reasons or whatever. But to me, Magic and Steph, they're the two best point guards of all time. It's not up for debate. Similar to how I feel about the GOAT debate, where I'm like, I don't want to hear anyone's name besides for Michael Jordan and LeBron. I really do not think anyone has a real legitimate argument for being better than those two. Same goes for point guards. I actually think who the third best point guard of all time would actually be a pretty interesting conversation. There's a lot of candidates and there's no clear answer, and it really, again, there's generational stuff that comes up in all this. That's not the discussion for today. I'll table that. Maybe we'll have it sometime. I want to talk about what it actually means to be a point guard, because that's the first thing that makes this argument a little bit weird. Older NBA fans are probably going to pick Magic. Younger NBA fans are probably going to pick Steph. That's just kind of the way it goes. Steph's jersey is right behind me, okay? He's my second favorite player of all time, so just want to acknowledge that as well, that I do have that bias. But Magic is one of my favorite players of all time too. Definitely one of my favorite players to watch highlights of, because his passing is super fun, and, you know, winning time is really fun. That's not a real reason, but you know. I believe the last time I did a top 50 all-time players list, which was a couple of years ago, I had Magic as the third greatest player of all time. I actually go back and forth between who I think is third between him and Kareem, because I actually think that Magic has a real argument for being ranked higher all time than Kareem, but again, I am bringing up other conversations. There is a discussion about what you want out of the point guard position. Some people will say you can't even argue that Steph is a better point guard than Magic Johnson. You could argue he's a better player, but not a point guard. Now, to me, I feel like that's getting caught up in kind of unnecessary semantics, but I do understand where it comes from. There is the true point guard versus the scoring point guard debate. And if there's any position that encapsulates the idea of primarily being a playmaker, which is what a true point guard is, just guy who makes plays for his teammates more than himself, someone who doesn't really opt to shoot the ball all that much. Magic took like 12 shots per game, which isn't all too high. 20 point per game score, obviously that's a little high when you compare him to some other guys who are labeled as true point guards, but Magic is absolutely a pass first player. He really, every time, the funny thing about Magic is every time he scores, it almost seems reluctant. Like he's like, damn, I can't get a dime right now. Guess I'll score. I guess I have to score. Oh well. If you're a big true point guard stan, if you really like that concept of lead guy who just puts up a bunch of assists, well, I'm very vehemently against it. I think that true point guard is bullshit, and I think it is a criticism that is levied often against modern NBA players and modern guards that's completely unfair, and often those criticisms happen for Steph. They argue he's a shooting guard playing point guard because he only averages like 6-7 assists. That's not what a real point guard is. I disagree vehemently. I think that the point guard position is, do you play the point guard position? Are you listed at point guard? Does your team use you as a point guard more often than anything else? Yeah? Well, then you're a point guard. So That is an important distinction to make. I really don't buy into the true point guard thing all too much. But if you were going to, if there is any player to pick to be adamant about the true point guard angle, it would be Magic Johnson. Because what I will tell you, something I argue all the time, is that there hasn't been a true point guard who was the best player on a championship team in NBA history, except for one time, when Magic Johnson did it 3 times. And by it, I mean averaging double-digit assists on his way to a championship. In his first 2 titles, they had Norm Nixon on the roster, and he was being utilized as a 2-guard, and like him and Norm kind of split the playmaking. That's actually ironic because people will be saying Curry's actually a shooting guard, so you can't compare them. Meanwhile, Magic won 2 championships, not even playing point guard. But that aside, double-digit assists. That is kind of the threshold of a true point guard, a star true point guard. If you're up to double-digit assists, well, that's pretty fucking great. If we're looking at peak from 83 to 88, which is what I picked to be Magic's best years, 83, 84 season, I believe, is the first season that he did not have Norm Nixon on the roster, so he was allowed to play the point guard position, obviously. But over that stretch, he averaged 12.5 assists per game in the regular season and 13.6 in the playoffs, and that's over just under 100 games. I believe it was 94, and he's pairing that with just 3.5 turnovers per game. 13.5 assists to 3.5 turnovers is a phenomenal ratio. Averaging 13.5 assists, and you're not even cracking 4 turnovers, super impressive. It's also worth mentioning that I do think Curry's playmaking is harder to evaluate for people. Like Magic being able to get the dimes that he does, the way that he passes the ball, that's obviously great to anybody. Watch a fucking 5-minute highlight clip of Magic Johnson passing, and you'll think that nobody ever passed it like him, which, in my opinion, it's because that's true. But playmaking isn't just passing, and one thing that Stephen Curry has made people add to the NBA zeitgeist more than ever before was acknowledging what gravity actually does and the value that that brings. For those who may not be aware, gravity is essentially the concept that as a scoring threat, regardless of where on the floor, as a scoring threat, a team is going to focus on you at points when they realistically would otherwise make different decisions defensively, but you're just so dominant one-on-one as a scorer that the defense is inherently going to have to pay extra attention to you. It can be Stephen Curry from 40 feet out, or it can be Shaq from 5 feet from the basket. Either way, the defense is, the gravitational pull is bringing them in towards that player, and that's creating an open opportunity for their teammates. Now, the fact that Steph can do that from 40 feet then means that he is opening up opportunities pretty much across the floor. Like where the defense might get sucked in from the 3-point line to Shaq, giving like Robert Horry an open 3, for example. Steph will be getting trapped at half court, and then someone will get an open layup out of it. And that type of playmaking, that won't necessarily result in an assist for Steph. Oftentimes, Steph will get like, I don't know, I'd call it like a ghost assist, where because he was running out to get an open 3-pointer, the defense panicked. They didn't know if they were supposed to switch or not, so both of them went. Someone else rolls to the basket, and like Draymond Green finds them. That type of play was pretty much the foundation of the Warriors' offense. Either you leave Stephen Curry open, or you leave someone else open because you're so fucking terrified of leaving Steph Curry open. And that is a dynamic that you add to an NBA offense that unfortunately is not as simple as counting assists, and unfortunately is not as simple as watching a highlight mix of passes. It's harder to find these plays. You really have to look out for the nuances of it. It definitely is out there if you want to find it, especially like think pieces are out there about it. As a whole, I do want to make that point about playmaking. Yes, better passer, Magic Johnson, it's not close. And to me, better playmaker is also Magic Johnson, but the difference isn't as significant as looking at like 7 assists per game versus 13 would make you think. It's not as though Magic is double the playmaker that Stephen Curry is. I don't think it's to that extreme. Now, as it relates to the point guard stuff, Curry also does a lot more off-ball stuff, and you can use that as a criticism to him, As a point guard, you know, he's more of a shooting guard because look, he's focused so much on shooting. First of all, Steph is fucking phenomenal with the ball in his hands. But second of all, Curry is too good of a shooter that if you didn't utilize him off ball, it would be stupid. It would be incredibly ridiculous not to use that shooting to its full advantage without the ball in his hands. And I am a strong believer in the notion of less is more offensively. The more ways you can get your star player to score without exerting a bunch of energy by dribbling the air out of the ball, the better. Stephen Curry catch and shoots are easy offense for him. Even when he does get a good contest, it's pretty easy offense for him. And having something like that that you can rely upon, I think it's ridiculous to punish the idea of this player for that reason. As for who's better with the ball in their hands, I would probably give a slight edge to Magic in that regard, but Curry's pull-up threat especially makes him more dangerous as soon as he crosses half court. Magic wasn't even really capable of shooting threes until super late in his career. Obviously, this is where the context of the era comes in. That is a factor here. We can't pretend like that's not there. What I find interesting about it, as it relates to gravity, I feel like Magic almost has the reverse of it. How I said earlier where it almost feels like Magic reluctantly scores the ball, I feel like Curry was such a good scorer that it led to assist opportunities either for him or someone else to make the play while he's just bringing the defense's attention away from it. But Magic's kind of the opposite. The threat of the pass from Magic was so significant that the defense often wouldn't jump with him at the rim on the fast break. He would end up getting open opportunities because they're expecting Magic to dish the rock. They're like, oh, we got to get a body on James Worthy. We got to get a body on Kareem as they're running down the floor. Meanwhile, Magic is running down the floor and no one gets in his way. That happens pretty often when you watch old games of his. So that actually led to him being a super efficient scorer, especially given the context of his era. Now, Stephen Curry is one of the most efficient high-volume scorers of all time. In fact, I believe he had statistically the most efficient 30-point-per-game season in the history of the NBA. But Magic was a low-volume scorer. He didn't go for 30 points. He was an 18 to 22 range type of player. He was capable of scoring more points than he actually did, but he was so pass-oriented that that's just not the approach that he had. But back in the 80s, the average true shooting percentage was 54%. At Magic's peak, those previous years that I mentioned, 83 to 88, he was around 61%, a whole 7% better than league average for that long of a stretch. That is massive. That is an extremely efficient player. And when you contextualize like the team that he had around him, because there were other scorers on the roster, like Magic ends up not getting the defense's attention as a scorer to the degree that his teammates get the attention, expecting Magic to set them up. So he took advantage of that pretty much wherever he could. Steph never had such a luxury. He has always been, as a scorer, the #1 target the defense was worried about, other than when he was with Kevin Durant. And even then, I would still argue that the defense was marginally more worried of Steph. Not like you're not terrified of both of them either way. I also do feel like we could briefly talk about the context of the eras here. 1980s and the 2010s, which were Curry's best years, were offensively minded eras. I do not think that you can make the grit and grind back in the day. No. I think people talk about the 80s like their 90s, 2000s level of physicality and defense, and that's just not really the case. The pace was much higher, the game was far more focused on offense, and it was generally an offense's league. That changed because of the Detroit Pistons, ironically, I believe because they beat the Showtime Lakers in the finals. They lost to them in 88, but I think they got them in 89 or 90, whichever year that was. I gotta look that up. I gotta be sure that's right. Yeah, they beat the Lakers in 1989, and when the bad boy Pistons get on the scene, you will just notice this gigantic, stark drop-off in terms of offense in the NBA. Point per game numbers plummet. Like, the league becomes the dead ball era as we know it, and becomes more that physical game that you know it to be. but Magic was an offensive player, a dimer in the perfect era for it. Obviously, modern NBA, three-point shooting, more spacing, that would have been cool, but the 80s were a good place for Magic to be for his play style. Like, it's not as though we're gonna have a time machine and take Steph and drop him in the 80s and take Magic and drop him in his time, and that's just like fair. Like, Steph grew up and came into a league where three-pointers were at least not a gimmick. Obviously, not what he ended up bringing it to be, but it's not to the same level of scrutiny that you would have got for shooting threes like he did in the 80s. I don't think there is much to knock either of them for as it relates to their era. For me, the 80s and onward is when I really start to think the competition in the NBA is really legit. Like, 60s, it's a little fuzzy. 70s, it's just a weird time in the NBA because the ABA was pulling a bunch of talent away. However, 80s and onward, I respect that wholeheartedly, and I'm not going to do the 80s was a weaker era, so Steph gets more credit. Offensively speaking, I think a lot of people do not appreciate that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar declined pretty significantly into his tenure with the Lakers, to the point where he's not nearly the Kareem as you know him from his peak on this team. And a lot of people like to hold the Lakers against Magic, how good this team was. And no doubt he was drafted into about as good of a situation as you can really fucking conceive of. Had the best player in the NBA at the time, a bunch of really good role players and play finishers who fit well next to Magic, and that worked. It worked immediately. What I would argue is, well, why were the Lakers, supposedly an amazing team, getting 45, 40 wins with regularity? Like, really, this was a team that happened to be built great around Magic, but Kareem wasn't exactly setting the league on fire, despite the fact that he was still clearly the best player in the league. And he won MVP in Magic's rookie season, but after that, not really in that conversation other than the year after it. He did get fourth in voting in 84 and 85, but I don't really, fourth in MVP voting is kind of like where it starts to drop off and not really mean that much to me. After top three, I don't really care too much. But if you look, Kareem, after the first two seasons, if you'd follow that from beginning to end of when he retires from 82 to 89, 18.8 points, 6.6 rebounds, 1.6 blocks, 56% from the field. If we're being nice and focusing more on before he fell off a little bit in the latter years, he's a 22 point per game scorer, 1.9 blocks a game, 7 rebounds a game. Nothing ridiculous. We're not talking about the guy who earlier in his career is getting fucking 30 and 15 and 4 blocks, you know. He wasn't that tier of player anymore. If you look at the earlier years of his career from 69 to 80, right before when Magic got drafted, he averaged 28 points per game and 14 rebounds, 3.5 blocks. I feel like people talk about Lakers, Kareem, and Magic and Kareem as a duo as though Kareem was this version of him alongside Magic. No. He was a much worse player. He was already in his 30s when he played with Magic, and he was getting into his 40s by the end of the tenure. So, like, for example, in their 1988 championship, Magic, first of all, was robbed the finals MVP. Should not have given that shit to James Worthy. The number difference here is pretty ludicrous to me, because Magic is scoring 1 less point per game, but he's getting 4 times the amount of assists, and there's no other stat that James is beating. Like, that level of distribution, I just don't think. I mean, I think it's insane that James won that award. To be fair, Magic probably shouldn't have won Finals MVP in 1980. It probably should have gone to Kareem. In 1988, he had James Worthy, who is really good. He's one of the top 75 players of all time. He was one of the top 50 players of all time back when that list was put together. I don't think the dude was quite a superstar. Highest in MVP voting he ever got was 12th. He's been NBA, All-NBA third team 2 times. That's it. No other All-NBA teams otherwise. Couple of all-star selections, but not some dude that I'm like, wow, this guy is such amazing help, such an amazing player. He's a good player, but nothing crazy. Byron Scott, I actually think super underrated player in general, especially in the latter end of this Lakers tenure. Like, he got up to being a 20-point per game scorer, and like him and James Worthy stepping into the fold made up for Kareem falling off a little bit offensively. But if I'm looking at the 1988 NBA Finals, or NBA playoffs rather, where they ended up winning the championship and Magic should have been Finals MVP, Kareem averaged 14 points and 5.5 rebounds. That's not great. That's not a lot. Meanwhile, Magic's here with 20 and 12.5. If we go to the 1987 run, Kareem is averaging 19 points per game. Magic, 22, 12.5 assists, averaging more rebounds on top of that. Kareem's still getting 2 blocks a game, which is nice, but again, we're talking about a far worse version of Kareem, and Magic is winning these championships as the clear and away best player on the team. It's not a competition. He is very easily the best player there. I wonder if 85 even, what that title run, what Kareem put up. Let me check. Yeah, Kareem's at 22 points, 8 rebounds at that point. That's a little bit better. But even then on that run, Magic averaged 17, 7, and 15. 15 assists per game for an entire title run. It's kind of ludicrous to me how much people hold Magic's team against him, because truly they weren't anything resembling a super team other than the first couple of years of his career, and he wasn't even really unleashed or utilized properly early on to his career. So later on, Kareem declines, he takes more of the job, and he still keeps the Lakers a dynasty when otherwise it probably wouldn't have been if Kareem was not the player that he was beforehand and Magic wasn't actually that good. But no, Magic was actually that fucking good, and he kept leading his team to 55, 60 plus win seasons and winning championships along the way, winning MVPs along the way. So I think Magic's help is overall overrated. I might make a video on Kareem in general about why I think he's also just a dash overrated, for the reason where, again, people talk about him like he was that peak version of himself when he wasn't. But when you talk about Curry's help, he obviously had Kevin Durant for 2 of his championships, and Kevin Durant was a lot fucking better than 18 points and 7 rebounds. A lot fucking better than 14 points and 5 rebounds. Ironically, if I was going to use help as an argument, if I was going to say who had more help, I would go with Steph. I would say that Steph had more help throughout his career, and there's an argument to be made. I don't necessarily agree with it, but Steph might only have 2 rings if Kevin Durant never joined that team. I think they probably would have ended up winning it anyways, but it sure as shit wouldn't have been the cakewalk that it was, and one way or the other, you gotta stand by that. You played next to one of the best players in the world. Klay Thompson, Draymond Green. I don't know if Klay's in my 75 greatest players of all time, but Draymond probably is. I know it's a controversial take to think that Draymond is better than Klay, but whatever. I think peak Draymond was better than peak Klay, just because I value the Swiss Army knife element that he brought to them, which I thought was more fundamental than just having an extra shooter. Not suggesting Klay wasn't super important, but neither of those guys were superstar tier guys. They had times in the league where they were in the top 20 conversation, but at no point were they like superstar tier. And when they won the championship in 2015, especially, like, Draymond hadn't even really developed his playmaking ability at that point. That came in year 2 of the Warriors dynasty. Klay Thompson was not quite as good. Got a little bit better and became an all-star. Again, this happened the second year of the dynasty. He wasn't an all-star that first year, at least as I remember it. Let me double check. No, he was an all-star in 14-15. Never mind. What I'm getting at, essentially, I actually think that Steph had a little bit more of an edge help-wise. I think that the level of help that Magic had is dramatically overblown because the image of who Kareem was at that time was dramatically overblown. Better team goes to Steph, better help goes to Steph. If I have to choose better era that I think I respect a little bit more, I would go with the more modern era. I was there to see it with my own 2 eyes. It's definitely biased, but it is what it is. Competition-wise, Larry Bird had a great rival throughout his career in Bird, obviously. Steph had LeBron. Now, what's interesting about that is LeBron is a better rival because he's better than Larry Bird was, but Magic was probably better than Bird, or at the very least, it was a discussion where in this matchup, Curry versus LeBron, there really weren't a lot of people who ever thought that Steph was better than LeBron. It was like, yeah, Steph's great. LeBron's LeBron, though. So I don't know how much the rival thing factors into this. They ultimately played each other in the finals in both cases a lot. So if you wanted to take it into consideration, though, I would say Magic kept up and was him debatably being the better player in the rivalry is probably better than definitely not being the better player in the rivalry. I don't know. I don't know if that's really anything anyways. Neither are strong defenders. We're not going to factor that in much. I really don't think anyone's making this decision based on defense. Magic is 6'9", so obviously he's inherently a little bit better of a defender. I really don't think it's anything special. They also both have that trait where their playmaking is their steal numbers are really high earlier on in their careers, and it really gives you an impression that they're a better defender than they actually are. Man, it's difficult because these are very different approaches to the game. It's very different eras, and it's very different teams. But that's the problem with comparing these eras, and I'll say that every time, that there is no exact science to this. This is all coming off like a ramble because that's mostly what any type of all-time debate looks like. There's so many angles to take into consideration. If I have to pick, gun to my head, I will take Magic. I will take Magic Johnson. Passing is the defined skill of the point guard position, for good reason. Point guard at large, even in the modern NBA, is still the primary playmaker on most teams. Not across the board anymore, as it used to be, where pretty much every time the best playmaker would be a point guard, but as a whole, the point guard position is still more about passing than it is about scoring. Steph is obviously a better scorer than Magic. I really don't think anyone would argue different, especially with how low volume Magic was as a scorer, not really getting over 20 points all that often. And as I mentioned earlier, playmaking is more than passing, so that takes the gap between Steph and Magic and it closes it rather significantly. It's not dramatic enough to bridge the gap. It's not enough to put him anywhere near Magic as a playmaker to me. I would consider Steph a top 10 playmaker of all time, but Magic is an outlier level playmaker. No one else averages that assist total, and it's a good thing except for Magic because he was that good at passing. And I think in terms of like just vibes and having fun and being revolutionary, like Steph was revolutionary for his shooting. Everyone knows that. But Magic was a 6'9" point guard in the 80s. That was extremely convention breaking. That's why they played him as shooting guard initially. That's why a lot of people had doubts for him coming out of college, because they were like, how is this going to translate to the NBA level? The idea of having a player that tall being a ball handler was kind of ludicrous at that time. He changed that, and now having a 6'8", 6'9" ball handler is like the meta. I feel like in the ways that Steph was creative and innovative with his shooting, Magic was creative and innovative with his passing. I think picking Curry is entirely valid. I don't have any issue with you if you think Curry is a greater player and a better player. But for me, I will go with Magic. After the top two, for me, Bron and MJ, I don't really think it's that ridiculous to put a handful of guys from spots like 3 through 12. There's definitely some nuances within that. There's guys who I would put at 3 that I think you'd probably be pretty ridiculous to put at 12, but you get my point. I think this is a little bit more fluid than a lot of people like to think it is. Steph is my favorite player between them, but that's not even who I fucking picked. So let me know what you guys think down below. Let me know if you like this video by hitting that like button. Shout out to Nick for editing this video, and goodbye.